So my brothers and my sisters, as we embrace this urgency of creating the beloved community, now is the time to be loved. Love means understanding redemptive goodwill toward all which seeks nothing in return. So be loved by implementing the demands of justice to eliminate the school to prison pipeline that has so many black children entrapped. Be loved by correcting voting policies that seek to suppress the votes of millions of black and brown people. Be loved and implement the demands of justice by transforming a society that is disproportionately violent toward black lives, including black transgendered lives and indigenous lives. Be loved and correct false narratives and economic policies that continue to divide and pit poor and working class black and white people against each other. Be loved and implement demands of justice where systems and structures are deconstructed and lead the way of living in community that reimagines just, humane, equitable, and sustainable policies, practices, and behaviors. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them who hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and abuse you. Be loved and do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God.
Welcome, welcome, welcome to part 3 of the King Center series on environmental justice. This is economics, equity, and environmental racism. This is a beloved community talk. We have a series of conversations here at the King Center called Beloved Community Talks, where we encourage courageous conversations. We model it, and then we invite you at home to be a part of courageous conversations and plan them in your homes. Not only that, in your workplaces, in your schools, communities, and one-on-one relationships. This is environmental racism in our world house, but of course the overall topic is environmental justice, with our theme for this episode being economics, equity, and environmental racism. Listen, as we go through this conversation, you'll hear a lot of acronyms and a lot of words that you may want to take the time now just to write down. And as we go through them, we'll look them up and we'll talk about them. So I want to introduce some of those words to you as we prepare to bring on our panel. Excuse me. And certainly, on behalf of our CEO, Dr. Bernice King, welcome you again. But wherever you're joining us from, I want you to drop this link to this episode, this Beloved Community Talks series on your IG. If you want to go ahead and post the graphic for it, you can find that on our platforms and say you're watching now. Provide the link. It's on our YouTube channel. You can drop it on Facebook. It's streaming right now on our King Center and Bernice King and Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King platforms on Facebook. Share the broadcast wherever you're watching it from. Share it. Retweet it if you're watching it on Twitter. Share the link if you're watching it on YouTube. And then do this. Go ahead and look up some words like carbon emissions, carbon footprint, greenhouse effect, greenhouse gases. We're going to go through some things. We want to educate in this conversation, but also invite you to some calls to action. And we have an esteemed panel who will be joining us. And in our last segment, we'll be joined by Dr. Bernice King. And we want this to be the question we answer finally in our conclusion today. Where do we go from here? And what action can we take to address, to prevent, to curtail, to eradicate environmental racism, in particular in this conversation as it pertains to equity and economics? And so the last acronym I want to leave you with before the panel comes on is ESGs. I want you to Google that. Look it up. ESG. ESG. Greetings. Greetings, Marion. Thank you for joining us in Kansas. Please let us know where you're joining us from. And if you're sharing about this broadcast, use Courageous Conversations, hashtag Courageous Conversations, hashtag BCT, hashtag Beloved Community Talks. We have a lot of topics that trend out there. We want to get these types of conversations trending. And so now we'll have our panel come on. Again, we're talking economics, equity, and environmental racism. Economics, equity, and environmental racism. Our first panelists, I'm going to introduce all of them, all of our panelists, and then once the introductions are done, we'll have them all come on screen. William J. Barber III is the founder and CEO of Rural Beacon Initiative. He's a renewable energy professional and a passionate advocate for environmental and climate justice. We'll let him share a bit more about himself as he comes on. Our next panelist, Jillian Grennan, is associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley Haas School of Business. She is affiliated with Berkeley's Institute for Business and Social Impact and teaches the Sustainable Investment Fund course. Welcome. Joining us also, Kamar R. Jones, a management consultant with Falcones, a highly experienced financial and management consultant with over 23 years of expertise. He's worked globally with major companies in various industries. Welcome. Ryan P. Parker is the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at CGI, a global IT and business consulting firm. He has over 20 years of experience leading metric-driven DE&I strategy. Welcome. We're grateful indeed for this panel joining us, and we look forward to seeing them all on screen now.
Hello, hello, hello. Great. I know we're working on a little mic issue there, but thank you to Vanetta for getting us started here. I'll dive into a further intro. Really excited to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. As was mentioned, my name is William J. Barber III. I am the founder and CEO of Rural Beacon Initiative. We are a BIPOC social enterprise that focuses on addressing the two but connected challenges of the history of Black land loss in the Southeast, but also the increasing threat of climate change in the rural Deep South. We as an organization believe that those closest to the problem can also be those closest to the solution. And we work with a committed mission to increase ownership diversity in the emerging supply chains of regenerative agriculture and renewable energy. I am so excited to join this panel, this discussion, as we are living in a really historic opportunity of both energy investments, but also an opportunity to redress some of the systemic harm that have for too long plagued communities and locked communities into silos of underinvestment, of inopportunity, of injustice, and really excited to begin discussing some of those solutions and opportunities on tonight's discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, William. Ryan, you share with us. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So good evening, everybody. So honored to be a part of this conversation. Thank you to the King Center for hosting these very important discussions, community discussions. I think that we are at a very pivotal time in our country as we're leaning more into doing what my brother William just said, righting some of the historic trauma that has affected many of our communities. Ryan Parker, Vice President for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, a global IT business consulting company. Interestingly, though, I spent the majority of my career prior to joining CGI 2 years ago in healthcare. And so conversations around understanding that one's zip code is a greater indicator for one's health outcomes than their genetic code is something that we've been talking about for quite some time in healthcare. And so it gives me great joy to know that we're beginning to think more deliberately about ways to move society forward, hold corporations more accountable, and those who develop policies that impact communities of color in negative ways and positive ways to really lean into understanding that one's zip code is more of an indicator of one's quality of life than one's genetic code. So I'm excited to be a part of this conversation, looking forward to contributing from a DE&I perspective and challenging corporations today on what they could be doing differently and thinking about differently to move the country forward.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Jillian, welcome. Welcome to each of you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me for one of these beloved community talks. I think it's a wonderful topic, and I'm really excited to dig into it. As a professor, this is actually my favorite class to teach, is to teach about ESG and some of these acronyms we're going to talk about tonight. You know, it's really important to teach and to educate and make sure that everybody understands that they can be a part of this change and they can be a part of, you know, solving some of those problems that the systems have created, whether it's, you know, to evaluate companies, to help participate in the change, and really to, you know, make the system more just. And so these are a lot of the things that I like to talk to my students about and teach them about. And I'm excited to, you know, share some insights about tips you can do every day at home just on these topics.
Thank you so much. Kamar.
Hey, thank you, Vanetta. My name is Kamar Jones. I'm a principal consultant at Falcone, which is the largest Brazilian management consulting firm, and been brought on to expand into the U.S. I've been doing this type of consulting for the last 17 years, and prior to that, I did financial consulting and capital markets. And my experience takes me into 6 different continents, working and consulting major corporations in a wide, diverse amount of industries. And so, and my experience has been, and that's why I love this topic, is that my experience is that I have had cross-functional teams and a lot of diverse teams. And from my experience, again, is that when we had that diversity, we always had much better results, because not only do you have a diverse group of people of color and cultures, but a diversity in thinking. And this diversity in thinking is what's leading and driving ESG initiatives. Many people think it's the government. It's not the government. It's the private sector that's driving this. They want it. People are demanding it. And more importantly, it's economically viable. And so I want to bring that out in this discussion today. This is not a left issue. It's not a right issue. It's a money issue. And those that want to continue to play politics and be on the sidelines are going to be left out of a tremendous amount of opportunity. And then many of their constituents are going to miss out because companies are going to go where they wanted to be. And this is a driving growth area. So looking forward to this discussion. And an honor to be amongst some wide, diverse group of people in this audience. So thank you. Thank you, Vanetta. Thank you, Dewan, and others.
Thank you so much to each of you for being a part. We have Vivian joining us from Larkspur, California. Folks joining us from Brooklyn and other parts of this country and the world. Cleveland rocks, I heard. I haven't been to Cleveland, but I hear it rocks. We want to just be sure we welcome all of our audience members, all of our participants, and those tuning in everywhere. And I thank each of you again for being a part. This is an important conversation. And hopefully, when I talk to people, I say these are the types of conversations that we want to eventually talk and work ourselves out of even needing to talk about it. Because maybe, and it's possible, we believe at the King Center, it's wholly possible that we can create that beloved community where these issues aren't prevalent anymore. But we believe we have to start with some education. So we just want to start out with defining some of these words that we commonly hear. We're talking about economics, equity, and environmental racism. Let's talk for a moment about what equity is. So we don't want to take for granted that we're all understanding as we watch and engage in this conversation what it is. What is equity? Ryan, what is equity? How would you define it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Equity is basically laying the foundation and level setting that we do not all have the same starting point. And understanding that because we do not all have the same starting point, that we have to customize the ways in which we serve people, the ways in which we better understand the needs of communities, so that we can add solutions that took into consideration the starting point. Equity is a process for achieving equality, achieving diversity, achieving inclusion, but it is just a basic realization that we don't all have the same starting point. And how do we customize based on what people's starting point is?
Wow. Equity is the process for achieving equality. That's going to resonate with me. That simplifies what's often can be a convoluted word or concept. Equity is the process for achieving equality, and it takes into account that people have different starting points. Jillian, you have anything to add to that or share, or any thoughts on what equity is, what it looks like?
I do have some thoughts to share on that. I think one of the thoughts is also to think about how we can all grow together in the sense that economic growth often has been disproportionate. And so as you grow, you can lift up many people through the process. And I think that that's a lot about why hopefully we're talking about investments and thinking through that more broadly and what companies can do. There will be a space for allocating and using your resources in the best way possible to achieve your own personal goals. It's not about necessarily what other people's objectives are.
Thank you. Kamar, any thoughts on equity?
A lot of times people confuse, and I was one of them at one point, confuse equity and equality, which you you articulated very well. But when I think of it, it's like at a track meet. I like to use a lot of sports analogies, and just imagine. Let's talk about inequity. If I'm running 100 meters, 100-meter dash, which I run a long time ago when I was in shape and young, it's a fair race when everybody gets to start at the same line and they go. That's fair. That's equity. The inequity part is when, let's say, one of the runners has a hurdle in front of him, a pit that's got alligators in it, and maybe some dogs or something, and the other person has wind behind their back, maybe someone encouraging them, and some of those things. And even though the distance is equal, it's clearly not a fair race, right? when you look at it that way. And so what equity is removing all those barriers and taking away all those privileges, or at least, or giving the same privileges to the person, and then making it more of a fair race or a level playing field, if you would. So that's how I would describe it to people, because I think people can resonate with that and see what we're talking about.
Sure. Yeah. Shortly before he was assassinated, Dr. King talked about this whole idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And he said that some people don't have boots. And maybe that's an example, Kamar and Jillian and Ryan, of what we're talking about. How can you do that? How can there be equity if we have different starting points? Some people have boots and some don't. And so that's a great description, Kamar. Thank you each for that. William, equity.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. And, just a few nuances to add to the answers here. I think, of course, it's been alluded to, but equity is different than equality. It's different than the concept of fairness. I think Ryan mentioned that it's a deeply procedural exercise. I also think it's an exercise that is informed by outcomes. What are the outcomes when we are looking at individuals who are affected by inequitable systems, processes, procedures? What are the outcomes that put them in a better place? I think it is also a deeply analytical exercise, especially in the context of environmental impacts, that looks at whether all people have similar rights and opportunities and basic needs to maintain an acceptable quality of life. When we talk about, access to green space, when we talk about being exposed to disproportionate levels of air pollution in certain communities, I think in the context of energy investment, you hear a lot of the buzzword around equity. I think it is also an exercise where we have to see, someone mentioned removing barriers. And I think that includes removing economic barriers that prevent communities that have for too long been siloed outside of the conversation of the benefits that this new burgeoning green economy has to offer. How do we remove those barriers to make sure that they can fully participate and not fully participate in predetermined roles, like your green workers, but also be entrepreneurs and owners in this space? So I think, there equity as a concept, and then there's equity as we get into some of these more nuanced topics that I know we're going to discuss tonight.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great segue into the topic, equity, economics, equity, and environmental racism, because as you mentioned, economics is one of the barriers that would prevent equity. And then when we talk about environmental racism, how do all of these E's connect when we want to create the beloved community? Our ultimate goal in these conversations is the beloved community. How can we help us think about how to get there? And how does inequity prevent us from getting there, particularly economically? And how do economics connect? Let's go to this question. How do economics connect to environmental racism? Anyone who wants to start, unmute and start. How do economics connect to environmental racism?
I guess I can start. I could start with that. The one thing I think of, Vanetta, with that is, let's say, for example, solar panels. Let's talk about solar panels. And at one time, if you don't have the economics to invest into these, then you're probably not going to be able to do it. Because if you're able to put solar panels, let's say, on your home, and let's say the home is large enough that has high energy bills, then it's going to be more economically viable to make this conversion. So the thing you have to have first is you got to have the economics or the money to be able to do this, because you have to pay for the panels. The home has to be large enough, or the utility bill has to be viable enough to make it make sense. Then a third one is it has to be available in your community. So, or you have to have maybe the opportunity to use leverage or credit in order to buy it. And so if you have an economically challenged area, they're probably going to be lagging behind on this technology that people can take advantage of. And let them, not even to mention having a tax write-off. Well, if your economics isn't there, a tax write-off doesn't mean anything. And so I think that's one example that I can see with taking advantage of environmental technology that's now been proven to be economically viable, but people that don't have the economics can't take advantage of, or be more difficult to make that conversion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
William.
Yeah, I'll jump in there, and I'll say, to just ground us in some of the thought of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who added this concept of the urgency of now. When we look at the base issue and environmental impact and the climate crisis, we have to recognize that is our generation's urgency of now. Climate change as a whole serves as a multiplier on every deep-seated social inequity that we, unfortunately, as a society have perfected over generation. I say perfected because those inequities have often been the result of intentionally bad policy decisions. To really understand how this manifests in the modern day, you got to look at history. So you got to look at the fact and look at the fact that climate change and fossil fuels have historically prevented economic opportunity in the same communities that now find themselves on the front lines of the climate crisis. Take it all the way back to the history of redlining, for example. We all know what redlining was. Redlining was a policy during the New Deal era by which the federal government, in conjunction with efforts to address a national housing shortage, actually developed a series of maps of every metropolitan area in the country. These maps were color-coded on to indicate to banks where it was safe to insure mortgages, areas where it was safe to lend essentially to American citizens. As we all know, areas that had high populations of Black or immigrant communities were labeled red as unsafe places. This government policy had a clear racial disparity, as these places were colored red to indicate that these neighborhoods were too risky to insure mortgages. Additionally, there was a document entitled the Underwriting Manual. Some of you all have seen this, that established explicitly segregationist policies as part of its recommendations, saying that incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that Black and immigrants should not be granted access to the same loans that were helping to increase access to housing for an emerging white middle class. Now, this had devastating long-term economic effects, including reducing en masse the opportunities for Blacks and immigrants to become homeowners and resulting severely in kneecapping their ability to accumulate wealth over a century ago. And when you look at the current racial wealth gap in the country, African Americans have only about 5% of the wealth as compared to white counterparts. And most of that disparity is directly related to the fact that Black and brown families were prohibited by federal policy in buying homes. This is actually laid out in Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. Now I'm going to bring it to the environmental impacts. The Underwriting Manual that I mentioned earlier made an additional recommendation that highways would be an effective tool in separating Black and immigrant communities from white neighborhoods. So beginning in the early 1930s, highways were preferentially constructed through over Black and brown communities across the nation. Entire communities were actually bulldozed for preferred placement of our national highway system. Communities like Freedmantown in North Dallas, Texas, West Belford in Houston, West Oakland in California. And to hammer home the environmental impacts, today highways are a significant source of air pollution with communities of color. The same communities that were redlined are now being disproportionately exposed to vehicular air pollution. There's a recent study that came out that said the same communities that were redlined also have 200% times more climate changing oil and natural gas infrastructure, fossil fuel infrastructure. So these are ways that we have to understand that history of inequity as we understand the present day.
Because clearly, and Ryan, I see you're unmuted too. If a child is born in one of those communities adversely impacted by these highways and then impacted by these economic disparities, that is not the same starting point as a child born in a community who's not experiencing those same effects. So this connection between equity and economics and environmental racism is all coming together. Ryan?
Yeah, and the only thing I would add, if there is a lack of opportunity to wealth, then affordable communities, affordable housing is in these areas that we just heard about, which only means we're perpetuating a cycle of continuing to perpetuate more harm and trauma for these Black and Brown communities. And it goes beyond just the more obvious things. As I told you earlier, I worked in healthcare for 20 years up to this point. And there have been studies after studies through a public health lens that now understands that respiratory related diseases like asthma, like COPD, are greatly impacting Black and Brown communities who live near tolls in New Jersey, right? Who live near landfills and so on and so forth. And so the implications on health are just as profound. And it is the reason why the health disparity gaps keep getting wider and wider if we do not address access to wealth and if we do not address the environment where Black and Brown communities are exposed.
So how does that connect to ESG when we consider all that we just shared and environmental social governance by corporations? What role do corporations play in ensuring that these effects don't continue to be multiplied and perpetuated in communities? What does ESG do to help curtail the dangers and the harms that we're seeing? Jillian?
So these environmental social governance, a lot of what they've been doing is to try and say, look, there's been externalities placed on firms that we can't trace to the firms. And so there's a separation between what, what their social value is and what the private values you see in the stock market. And really what people have been doing is trying to bring in these alternative metrics. And I know people in this group have worked on it. I've worked on it, on how can you come up with metrics to actually say, look, we know these really bad things have happened and we're causing trauma, and how do we fix it? And how do we trace it back to them so they can be held accountable, so they can pay their fair share and do these different things? And I think there's been a lot of work on this front, trying to push forward. You were talking at the beginning about the prison, but I think there's been a lot of people saying, like, are you actually hiring people out of prisons? Or if you're a firm that says you are doing this, are you doing this? Are you doing things that somehow support the private prison system or support prison funding and labor? If you are, maybe let's not invest in your company. And thinking about, are you involved in, I know we were talking a little bit earlier about defense, but thinking about this, are you involved in the surveillance of citizens, of immigrants, which has become an increasingly, topic of the rights. And so a lot of this is figuring out the best ways to measure it. And once you have it measured, then you can actually take strategies where you're either advocating for change within the companies, and I tend to be of the philosophy of advocating for change and getting this on the board and trying to bring it up and raise the issue, or you can be on the side of saying, look, I don't want to put capital there. And that's sort of really the two strategies people have been using and trying to pursue. And so if you don't want to put capital there, then you can invest in funds. So Adesina Social Capital is actually a great fund ran by an African-American woman who looks at exactly this and says, how can we do this in a more systematic way to basically, hopefully, now that they're getting money there, that the good companies are actually thriving and the bad companies aren't.
Wow. Responsibility. Kamar, I see you unmuted. You have something to share?
Yeah, I was going to elaborate what Julian said as to why companies should be doing this. Again, we already proven and discussed that diversity, equity, and inclusion actually benefits companies. In fact, there's been studies that shown that. McKinsey and Company did an article on that, Boston Consulting Group done one, and a Harvard Business Group review. Both showed that companies' revenue were about 19 to 25% higher that embraced that had more diverse leadership than those that weren't. So you look at the economics, that makes sense. That goes back to, again, and as the world becomes more global, you're not going to be able to get these same guys that look the same, act the same, think the same. They're not going to be embraced globally. Maybe in certain parts of the U.S. they would be, but so you're going to have a diverse group of people to go after these different markets and different opportunities. And let me just spin it on a positive note as to why this is beneficial to African Americans. We've just got to educate ourselves on it and educate others. Is that with that diversity that's going to be needed, you're also looking at more growth that's turning old industries that were dead and kind of dying into growth industries. The auto industry now converting to electric vehicles are going to need the best and the brightest of people, diverse teams and everything else, not only to go after markets here in the U.S., but globally. You even have sectors like the oil and gas, and I might get crucified here, but I've worked and consulted in these areas, and I know what they're doing. Oil and gas and mining are making major strides to reduce their carbon emissions. I see it in all of these companies' goals have emission reduction initiatives. And it's not, again, driven by government, it's driven by the public that's putting pressure on these companies. And also is driven because it makes sense economically. And one last example, I know British Petroleum, because I've looked into this and researched it. They have an entire business unit that's ESG. And they're not just investing into that just for lip service. I mean, they have an entire business unit. There's millions of dollars invested into just this topic because they know that if they don't change, they die. And so, again, a positive spin to this is that we as minorities in this country and gender and women can take advantage of these initiatives because it makes sense economically and it's high growth areas.
Thank you. Ryan, you have something to share. I also want to ask you, how does DEI work, authentic DEI work, impact ESGs? How do these two kind of join together to create justice? And we'll define justice real quick based on Dr. King's definition. He said at its best, justice is love correcting everything that stands against love. As I hear you all share, we need that. Because to be frank, because of these decisions and choices and legislation, people are dying and they're sick. So now we're faced with what can we do in corporations and in education and legislation to effectuate some change. So how do you think, Ryan, DEI work does that in tandem with ESG?
So good question. I just want to quickly respond to the previous question.
Sure.
Too. I think another reason ESG could be an accelerator in how we're addressing some of these societal issues is that it is stakeholder and shareholder driven. So there's a different level of accountability once your shareholders and your stakeholders are leaning in with greater intentionality, asking, what are you doing to restore the social contract between corporations and society? And so that is a good thing about the ESG. It can accelerate accountability. Now, to the question you just asked, let me just first level set by saying that, and some of this is echoing what my colleagues have already said, that if diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice is not foundational to a corporation's business strategy, be it your internal strategy or your external commitments to be a responsible corporate citizen, you will not optimize business performance. You will not optimize business performance. You will not build or strengthen relationships with your shareholders and your stakeholders. And here's why, because their expectations are evolving. We have seen shareholder and stakeholder expectations evolve rapidly since the death of George Floyd. Once organizations made these bold commitments around diversity and becoming anti-racist organizations. And now shareholders and stakeholders, they're wanting to know, do your values align with ours? Because we too are wanting to be a more responsible corporate citizen. And so what I think DE&I does is it's not so much a matter of how does it influence it, but how does DEI become a lever to level set and to be foundational to what ESG means? Equity needs to be foundational, a cross-cut over everything that we're doing in our business strategies and our corporations, but it needs to be a cross-cutting philosophy in the E, the S, and the G. Some organizations have a tendency to put these D and I under one of them, the social part, or when it was corporate social responsibility, right, which is the precursor to ESG, which we probably have time to talk about today. This has been evolving, right? And organizations, quite frankly, are still trying to figure it out, to be honest with you. But I think what DE&I can do, it can ensure that equity is a lens that is layered as corporations are building their ESG frameworks. It's a matter of having DE&I at the conversation, a priority at the conversation, so that we do not miss the opportunity to make it foundational to how we're building out our strategy. You know, what's not at the table becomes a blind spot or an afterthought. And so D&I can uncover where the blind spots may be. I think secondly, it will ensure that the likelihood of the interests of the most underserved and disenfranchised will be at the table. Those interests will be discussed. They would not be discussed after the ESG framework is rolled out, which is oftentimes what happens in corporations when they have this as a blind spot. If they're not talking about equity and diversity from the onset, it becomes an afterthought. I think what will also happen, it will, here's what we know. In DE&I, although the DE&I landscape has evolved, I've been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion since dating back to when we called it minority affairs, all right? And so it has evolved. Minority affairs, multicultural affairs, diversity, inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion. Now it's diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. And since 2020, it's been diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice, right? So it's constantly to evolve. But here's what we know, is that we have learned enough in the DEI space in organizations and leaders who have been intentional and deliberate. And so we're not really having to reinvent the wheel. We may be reimagining who's at the table creating the wheel, right? But we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. We have seen that supplier diversity programs, employee resource groups, multiplying board diversity and workforce diversity, and driving equitable policies. We've seen that have impact. So the goal now is, how can we take the lessons we've learned in the DE&I and embed that as a deliberate and intentional conversation and strategy over our ESG frameworks on the onset, so that it's not an afterthought. And so those are just some initial thoughts that I think that can help. You know, it would also challenge us to go deeper into data and not just look at data in the aggregate, so that we don't lose the story of who's continuing to get left behind, but to really stratify data through a lens of data justice to see who's not at the table and who's not being properly served, who's getting the brunt of harm.
Data justice. As we think about all this, William, we're looking at these 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We're sharing a lot with you, audience. I want you to know that on our social media platforms, we will put up in the next few days more about ESGs. There's a lot of acronyms here: DEIs, Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. But we want to really close out this conversation by answering the question, where do we go from here? See, somebody else put up data justice. Someone's listening from Arizona. Welcome to all of our audience from across the world. Where do we go from here? What can each one of us do? I want to read out some of these sustainable goals. Sustainable development goals. No poverty is goal 1. I read that, I said, wow. Because these are so aligned with how Mrs. Coretta Scott King in particular describes the beloved community. 0 hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation. And based on what William Barber III shared, some of that's not happening, and we know it's not in Jackson and Flint. And sometimes we can think of the United States and consider ourselves kind of absolved from having to consider these goals: affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, reduce inequality, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production. Is that the one? Do each of you think that's the one that we most can be personally accountable for? Climate action, life below water, life on land, peace and justice, strong institutions, partnerships to achieve goals, the goal. We'll also share the site where you can find these 17 sustainable development goals on our social media platforms. But based on those goals and what we're saying about ESGs and equity and environmental racism, what can we do? We're talking about this, William. What can we do? What's an action item that we can call people up to today?
Yeah, a few rapid fire thoughts, Renetta, because I know, we're coming up on time. Number one, I think we have to be aware that, this is an economic issue, but this is also a deeply moral issue. James Farmer Jr., the co-founder of the Congress on Racial Equity, said, at the height of the civil rights movement, if we do not save the environment, then whatever we hope to do in civil rights will be of no meaning, because then we will all have the equality of extinction. Said that decades ago. And also recognizing that in 2019, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights said that an unaddressed climate crisis, that's what we're talking about here, could potentially push more than 120 million more people globally into poverty by 2030, on top of the already 140 million poor people that are existing in the United States of America alone. So we got to really understand what is at stake. Number two, we really got to understand that though related, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice are not the same, one and the same, a 1-to-1 ratio for environmental justice, climate justice, and energy justice frameworks. And also we have to understand that we do not necessarily accomplish the goals of the latter by simply diversifying who is in the corporate C-suite. It may help, but it is not a guarantee that simply by putting additional Black and brown faces in that position that we get outcomes of more environmentally just, climate just, and energy justice policies. So we really have to be careful not to take the bait there. And then number three, I would say, looking at the 17 sustainable development goals is important, but we can also start right at home first. There are 17 principles of environmental justice that I think each of us need to be familiar with. And those come out of a nationwide movement of grassroots organizing on the ground through the toxic waste and race study that was published in the UCC Church, through the protesters in Warren County, through people who have lived this, citizen science, who have lived this and have made possible the conversation that the five of us are on today is directly made possible by their activism. So we need to be aware of that. And we also
Where are they, William? Where are they? Do you have a link to them that we can share?
We can drop a link to the 17 principles of EJ. We'll make sure you all have that. Absolutely. And then finally, recognizing that this moment of federal investment, we need to be sure that we're looking at things like the Inflation Reduction Act, what is being developed in the Justice 40 initiative to make sure that the government is driving forth policies that are more equitable, more beneficial for communities, looking at issues like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which establishes a $20 billion pot to capitalize a national green bank, which is going to be designed to drive investment, clean energy investments into historically disadvantaged communities. And we'll share some resources on that as well. That's work we're working on.
Thank you so much for that. Can you drop that link in our chat backstage?
Absolutely.
Right now, William, and then we'll get it going across the screen. We want to leave people with as many resources as possible, including, if someone could define real quick, greenhouse effects. We have some phrases we're using. We want to be sure as we close out and we say this is what we can do, that the audience actually knows what this means. So just one of those phrases for right now. And then we'll say, look up carbon footprint, Google carbon emissions. So you won't think, oh, these are just scientific terms. No, we can actually decrease our carbon footprint. We can, pay attention to some of the ways that we're contributing to harm. But if you would, please, William, could you share, or Ryan, what is the greenhouse effect, greenhouse gases? What does all of that mean to our sustainability, to our environment?
Ryan, did you want to take it? I can jump in, brother. Okay. Yeah. So when we talk about the greenhouse gas effect, this is also known as global warming, is essentially what we're talking about in terms of the consequences of climate change. And what it means is that solar radiation in the form of light waves on a regular day passes through our atmosphere, and most of that is absorbed by the earth and warms it. There is a small amount of that that in a normal reality is absorbed or is radiated back into a space and is trapped within our atmosphere, a very thin shell of gases that make up our atmosphere. What happens with the greenhouse gas effect is through pollution, through emissions, we are emitting gases that thicken that layer of atmosphere. And as we thicken that layer of atmosphere, more and more of that heat that is normally radiated into space and released gets trapped. And so it's like we're warming the pot. And that's where we see our rising temperatures. That's where we see our disruptions to our natural ecosystems and our weather systems. That's where we see the real harm being caused by the global climate crisis.
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing. Jillian, what can we do? What's an action step that we can call individuals and our collective selves up to?
Yeah, I think it's really about setting goals and taking it from where you are. I think to be individualized and to learn just like everybody is today, but also to seek help when you don't know. And I think that helps you to get into sort of this mindset that embraces sort of sustainable practices and connections. That being said, I think it's got to be about education and advocacy. I am a professor. I love to try and encourage people to do what they can do. And I think one of the things that really is going to be problematic is that as we increasingly recognize that we have surpassed this 1.5 degrees, that is going to lead to, even more extreme weather events. I think it's actually simple things like understanding your own resilience. Do you have a plan if the energy goes out, or if there is a fire and there's going to be smoke and you can't actually open the windows for fresh air? And sort of thinking through some of those things, I think everybody can come up with their own plan. I think if you have the money to invest or to do anything like that, and you're saying, how can I actually, with the money that I do have, I think there's opportunities out there. There's an ETF that was the one I was talking about earlier. I think she's wonderful and is doing a lot of really good stuff. It's Justice. I'll put that in the links, that is run there. I think there's other areas where that, ones I would think about is also just, thinking if you can invest in green spaces, because you recognize that, it is true that the simple act of gardening or tree planting, especially in urban environments where I know many of us live, where it is a lot of cement. The Biden administration is trying to come up with plans for, these cement oasis as they are, because it actually just radiates and it creates the heat that goes up and gets trapped even more. And so to the extent that you can do anything on that, I think it's really, is important. And, a plant gives you psychological benefits too. I like taking care of plants, and just really recognize that what you're doing, you're be optimistic that you are creating part of this change. And so by just even participating today, you're helping, and that's really a wonderful thing. And I really appreciate that about everybody listening today. So that's some of the ideas I have.
Thank you so much. Kumar,
I'll be real.
Action items we can call people up to.
I'll be real brief and target one specific one. So I have 3. Educate yourself and others. That's one of the things that we can do. Work and volunteer in the areas, whether it be with your company or volunteer or nonprofit organizations, things of that nature. And then finally, track results. And I want to focus on this more because I think this is where it falls off some. And so these targets and goals have to be with, and I'm going to throw out another acronym. It's SMART goals. What is SMART goals? Specific. They need to be specific. They need to be measurable. You got to be able to measure it. There's no sense of doing it if you can't measure it. It needs to be attainable. There's no sense of making a goal that you can't obtain. It needs to be reasonable. Do the people actually believe they can do it? And then finally, it needs to have a target. You got to have a target or a goal so you can say, okay, we made it. Let's celebrate. Let's set new targets. And so I would tell people that do those 3 things as a start, and I think we'll start to move the needle in this area. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then Ryan, close us out, please, with action step, something you believe we all can do.
I think first is go back to your companies tomorrow and ask the difficult questions. Do we have an ESG framework? Do we have, if you're at CSR, corporate social responsibility, do we have a corporate social responsibility framework? And depending on that answer, dig a little deeper. Are we thinking about equity in our goal to eliminate our carbon footprint? Have we thought about environmental justice in our overall strategy for ESG and CSR? So ask the questions tomorrow. Find out at your organization, where's our position? And then lastly, I would just say this, and I will leave this mantra with you. And I've shared this when I was in healthcare. There was this mantra that came out that said, no decision about me without me. No decision about us without us. Get engaged. Get at the table. Know the policies that are going to either have an impact for good on our communities, or they're going to have an impact not so for good on our communities. Know the policies that are on the ballot when you go vote. So vote. Get civically engaged. Otherwise, we will not know the decisions that are being made that is continuing to impact our communities, and we would have relinquished our voice in that process. So no decision about me without me. Get involved.
Wow. Thank you to each of you. This has been, for me too, an extremely learning conversation. Thank you for the links you shared. We'll be sure to get those out on social media. I just want to express on behalf of Dr. Bernice King our appreciation for you being with us for this discussion. We're going to move into our closing segment. And as we thank each one of you, we want to bring on Dr. King to close us out, to have a discussion around where do we go from here with what we've heard in this conversation, this beloved community talk. I'll share some of the things as Dr. King and I are discussing that we discussed in this conversation to kind of wrap up, to get us to a place as we conclude this 3-part series where we can say, this is what we want to do moving forward. We heard some of those suggestions at the end, but we want to connect our next steps to King Holiday, our summit that's coming up. We have a Beloved Community Global Summit each year in January during the King Holiday. So to connect the dots, we'll close out with some discussion around how we continue to educate and educate others, and some of the things that the panelists just mentioned as our next steps. Asking questions of our organizations where we work, of corporations that we're connected to, our carbon footprint, how we can decrease our use of some of the things that are harmful to the environment. So I'm going to ask Dr. Bernice King, CEO of the King Center, to join us now, invite her into this space as we close out. And if William Barber III is still backstage, we want to have him come back if he's available to share more about those 17 environmental justice principles as a part of our closeout as well. You pop back in. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome, Dr. King.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening to you. Good evening, my friend William. Good to see you. Thank you for being here with us. I want to thank all of the guests too. Very rich conversation and extremely powerful. And if I had to say anything about where do we go from here beyond what everybody else said, I think it's important that people who tuned in tonight share this conversation.
Yes.
With their particular friends and have conversations. You know, they can create conversations around it. We want to spread this because this is a very informative conversation tonight, especially the connection between the economics and the environment. Never quite saw it that way. And so I appreciate that insight on tonight. And I know that William is doing some great work in that regard and talking about where we go from here. You shared some things with me when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, William, about some work you're doing in the rural areas. If you can share a bit of that, because I always like people to hear about what people are also doing and to make an actual difference beyond the conversation, beyond the education, but the practical things that you are implementing. And I think you're doing something in partnership with Bullard. Is that his name?
That's correct.
Dr.
Yeah, Dr.
Bullard?
Robert
Yeah.
Bullard and Dr. Beverly Wright. Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yeah. I mentioned, well, let me say, number one, thank you again, Vanetta, for an amazing panel. Dr. King, good to, be on, and thank you so much for the conversations we've shared. Part of Rural Beacon's approach is really rooted in a deep history of advocacy that your father has laid, my father has laid, and really trying to understand how do we operationalize outcomes for justice, not just talk about it, but to actually see that, in communities on the ground. So, first and foremost, we founded Rural Beacon as a social enterprise. And a social enterprise was coined, the concept was coined by Dr. Muhammad Yunus of Grameen Bank, where he said, he had this quote that, too often we only use business to meet our selfish needs. And we fail to understand that business is an incredibly powerful mechanism to solve some of society's problems. And when you look at a social enterprise, it is actually an entity that it founded where profit is not the first goal. The first goal is to meet a identified social need in the community. The second or the tertiary goal is to generate profit that is then reinvested in the community or the project. But the first goal is to meet a social need. The need that we've identified at Rural Beacon is actually a continuation of the analysis your father did, Dr. King, when he pointed out the disparity in the willingness of, our government to essentially seed its white populace with an economic base through land grants, through training of how to farm land, through low interest rates on how to mechanize their farms, and the opportunity that either land ownership or home ownership has created for entire communities and families of a certain population in the United States. Those same opportunities were shut out for a significant portion of the population, for African Americans, for Indigenous, for Latino. And so, we are really looking at how to understand how we can push back against this pervasive issue of Black land loss and really establish a beachhead of rural economic development that is centered around solutions that are good for the people, good for the planet. We are doing a 52-acre site in Eastern North Carolina that we are converting from a traditional farming homestead to a model, what we've coined sustainability hub, comprised of regenerative agriculture, sustainable agroforestry, and agrivoltaics. And Vanetta, I know that's a lot of terms. We want to say, what do those mean? So regenerative agriculture, we're looking at, inputs and a type of farming process that actually benefits and increases the soil biodiversity. Because what has been shown is that when you do that, you actually can boost yields and boost the quality of your crops. We look at sustainable agroforestry, which is a mechanism or a framework for how we manage our timber stands that actually increase forest health and help sequester carbon. So it's actually a natural climate solution to removing greenhouse gas for the atmosphere. And then we look at agrivoltaics, which is defined as the co-placement of solar panels, photovoltaic panels, and crops in a way that creates co-benefits. We're doing this in a historic free community of color. We're doing this with Black landowners. And I think more importantly, we're piloting this project so that we can scale and replicate and go to additional communities and do similar projects. In that way, we believe we're truly increasing ownership in these communities and actually increasing educational awareness of opportunities in the emerging green economy.
Wow. And that really paints the picture of the connection between economics and equity and environmental racism, because you're talking about land ownership and doing it in a way that actually helps the environment, and it will help future generations potentially, William, be at the same starting point. I'm just still back in that conversation around equity because we so often misunderstand what equity is. So that's powerful. I just want to go ahead and let you know we have a podcast episode coming up on July 14th on the climate crisis and environmental injustice.
Yep.
And we'll be reaching out because this is tangible work. And I think it's important that we continue this conversation beyond today.
Right. And I'm dropping the link. You all can learn more at ruralbeaconinitiative.org. greenhousegashreduction.com. We are also doing some work with the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that I mentioned, working with the Coalition for Green Capital, which is one of the leading entities who has been at the helm of the Green Bank Network. And green banks are essentially these financing institutions that have worked to drive clean investments, energy investments, into areas that have traditionally been deemed economically unviable for traditional financing. So they're figuring out, how do we leverage creatively these systems of financing, these systems of technological innovation to truly create opportunity, at the grassroots level. And so I invite all of you all, reach out. You have our site there. Reach out to learn more, reach out to schedule a presentation, reach out if you would like to figure out a partnership, because we are really trying to do this work in a responsible way, but also in an urgent way that meets this moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Wow. Dr. King, as we wrap up and close out this conversation, just want to remind everyone that we do have some conversations coming up, but we don't want to leave this here. As I was sharing with William, I think we need to continue this on Be Love Day. Look at how to continue it at our summit in January, but also start to, in our social media platforms, share with people ways that they can be a part. So we'll share, as I conveyed earlier, the definitions for some of these words. We can put together, and we'll a sheet on environmental injustice and environmental racism, so that the King Center can even be a part of educating more excuse me, on this topic. But do you have any concluding thoughts on the importance of examining our climate, in several facets? I know we've been talking about that, but what we've discussed, Dr. King, is pointing us to the fact that our thought climate affects the external
climate. Yeah.
And so I want to close out with that our thinking, our consumption, even spiritually and mentally, what we take in is impacting how we engage our physical climate around us. So as we close out, you have any thoughts on that can carry us into understanding we need a holistic approach to all of these issues?
I think you've kind of summed it up. I think about the word of God that says, as a man or as a person thinketh, so is he. We manifest everything out of our thinking. And so we have to begin to challenge the climate in our mind on a daily basis, so that it aligns with what's just and what's righteous and what's equitable. And so our goal, as we do these Beloved Community Talks, as we do a lot of the work that we're doing, is to really ensure that our mindsets, the climate of our minds, are right. Because, when we talk about love, correcting everything that stands against love, you're talking about an internal thing, because you can't correct what's external if there's some incorrectness happening internally. And so we want to make sure that we're shifting these minds, that we are cleansing and purging these minds, that we are unlearning and re-educating. That's why you hear a lot of these phrases from us. And as we go forward, that we begin to change the climate of our minds, so that we can change the environmental climate, we can change the social climate, and the climate, in so many different ways in society. So again, thank everybody for joining us on tonight. Thank you, Dr. West, for moderating these 3 environmental panels. Again, I just want to challenge everybody to make sure you go back and listen. I'm going to definitely do that, and find ways to share it with others and create dialogue and discussion about it, because we all have got to accelerate our learning around the environment, and now understanding its connection to the economics of it. So thank you so much to all of our guests tonight, and to all of you who have tuned in tonight. God bless you.
Thank you, Dr. King. We want to invite you to, speaking of changing your minds, our Be Love Day. Wearing my Be Love shirt. Be Love Day is July 14th. 2023, this year, we want to invite you to be a part of this all-day virtual experience at thekingcenter.org, on our YouTube channel, on our social media platforms. You want to really know how to change your mind? We want to invite you to go to thekingcenterinstitute.org and study nonviolence with the King Center. And on September 9th, Saturday, September 9th, we have a Beloved Community International Expo where you'll be able to experience cultures from around the world. We believe we are interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent. And a huge part of our mind change is shifting from being self-centered to being other-centered. And we want you to join us on this journey of nonviolence and creating the Beloved Community where injustice ceases and love prevails. Host the Beloved Community Talks, conversation, pull up these YouTube clips, host the talks around this 3-part series on environmental justice. We want to learn more about that. If you do that, tag us at the King Center on Instagram, on Twitter, and on Facebook. Thank you again to all of our panelists. Thank you, Dr. King. Thank you to our audience for being a part of this conversation, and we will see you soon.
See you soon.